Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City. And I could leave it at that because today my guest and I are in New York City, unquestionably. But as always, greetings to Adagio listeners and viewers around the world. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, a video and audio streaming service dedicated to supporting artists and bringing classical music and opera to fans and music lovers all over the world. My guest today is an old friend. He's someone, in thinking about him, with whom I've lived basically a parallel life. We lived nearby one another. I don't know exactly when we met. Maybe you do.
Long
Um,
ago.
long ago, easily 40 years.
Yes.
And it could just well be that we were doing similar things. And I was always aware of him. I'll tell you his name in a moment. Respected him greatly, but didn't necessarily know everything that he was doing. And I don't think he knew everything that I was doing. But nonetheless, there clearly was as the Italians say, un feeling between us. In other words, a sense of awareness of commonality of interest and perhaps politics, but certainly cultural interest and care and deep care about it. And my guest is named Robert, or Rob Marx, as he is known, Marx. Are you related to either Carl or Groucho?
No, and good for you for asking both names, because when people ask me about relations, it's usually one or the other. And I'll ask them why they chose either the Marx brothers or Karl Marx, and you chose both. Good for
I
you.
grew up with both. That's why.
There's no connection to either, as far as I know.
No, but I forget, but there's a cemetery in London where Karl Marx is
Yes.
buried, and
Yes.
obviously it's not John Lennon there, but there's another Lenin who's not VI Lenin from old Russia, from the old Soviet Union, excuse me. Um, but I forget who Marx is. Oh, Marx and Spencer, the poet. That's who's buried near Karl Marx in London. Okay.
Well, it's within German families, both Jewish and not Jewish, it's not that uncommon a name.
It's true. Um, so where to be? I think I know where I want to begin. I didn't form questions for Rob because we know each other too well, but I only have one question. Were you born and did you grow up in New York City?
Yes, yes, in the Bronx.
In the Bronx?
Yeah, and so I am native to
I'm
our.
native as well,
I am
but
native.
we grew up obviously with different accents because I was born in Manhattan. I had a residency of 10 years in Brooklyn as a little child, and
Mhm.
then the rest of my life in Manhattan. Um, but growing up in the Bronx in the 1960s, as you did,
50s and 60s. Yes. Yeah.
yes, to what degree, either in your family or as a New Yorker who got on the subway at an early age,
hmm
were you aware of the cultural life of Manhattan, or were you exposed to culture in all of its forms in the Bronx?
Oh, that's a great way to begin. It really is. Because I was lucky enough to grow up in New York, in those post-war decades when there were no economic barriers between working class people and the arts in New York. First of all, the arts were incredibly cheap. You could go to a Broadway show for the price of a movie. It was the same price. You could sit. You could go to like the Rivoli or a Lowe's State movie theater down around Times Square, and for the same $3, you could sit in the second balcony of a Broadway theater. The same
Funny,
price.
Rob. I was about to say $3. How funny.
It was when I started out, the
Yep.
the bottom price was $3, and
Yep.
later on when I started to go into theater and was being trained, a lot of people would talk about economic equivalencies in that the cheapest seat, and this included the Metropolitan Opera, by the way. Herman Kravitz once said, who used to be a deputy director of the Met in the Bing administration, the cheapest seat would always be pegged to the price of a movie, and the most expensive seat would be approximately the price of a meal at a very good restaurant.
Mm.
And those were the economic equivalencies that producers used to think of. So I grew up at a time when these economic barriers that exist today with very expensive ticket prices, it didn't exist. It didn't exist. And there used to be an old marketing line in New York City related to our having 7 daily newspapers at that time. And the marketing line was that the New York Times sells the orchestra seats downstairs, but the Daily News sells the seats upstairs. Um, and I was aware of culture growing up. I'm from a German Jewish family, but very working class. My brother and I were the first people in the history of my family to have a higher education. Um, but my parents were, of that refugee generation that they would go to the theater once. So they didn't go to opera, they didn't go to classical music, but they did go to Broadway every once in a while. And they were part of that audience that would go to see like the original production of Long Day's Journey into Night, and also go to a once very famous American comedy called The Solid Gold Cadillac. And they would be
Judy
in
Holliday in one and Jason
the movie.
Robards in the other, but we won't say which is which.
Like the movie was Judy Holliday, but with a big difference because the play was written for again once upon a time famous American character actress named Josephine Hull,
Mm-hmm.
who was very well known even when she was a young woman. She
Yeah.
was famous for playing older characters, and the Solid Gold Cadillac was her last Broadway vehicle when she was really old. And then when it became a movie, Judy Holliday, who at that time was young and glamorous, played that part. So everything was adapted for her in the film.
Well, the
But
solid gold Cadillac is a perfect vehicle.
a perfect vehicle, exactly. Exactly. The kind of American theater that really doesn't exist anymore.
True.
Um, but also in terms of school, and I am a total product of the New York City public schools.
As am I.
But we had, and Fred, you must have had the same experience. There was universal music education already in elementary school. We had to learn our whole notes and our half notes. Um, Classical music was part of your instruction. And there was no dichotomy between the accessibility of the cultural world of New York and what you were learning in school. And because my parents came out of a world in small town rural Germany where basically all children went to work at age 13. You literally left home and you were my father was apprenticed in a hardware store quite far away, and my mother was apprenticed as a secretary in a tobacco factory
Mm-hmm.
not too far away from where she grew up. Um, and my parents understood that in
And
America.
she didn't grow up in Bayreuth, which has the biggest tobacco factory in Germany, does she?
Oh, no, 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 totally different in the West, near the Rhine, very,
Okay.
very close to the French border. But but my parents understood. They understood that in America, their children were not going to leave home at age 13, but they wanted their children in America to have the same sense of independence that a European kid would have. So we were trained from the get-go to be really on our own. And my 11th birthday present was that I could go on the subway in New York City alone wherever I wanted to go. I had to be home for dinner by 6 o'clock, but I was free to go. And somebody actually once said, a colleague of mine, I'm speaking to you from the conference room at the Samuels Foundation in New York City, and a colleague of mine here once said, "Oh, your parents wouldn't let you go alone on the subway until you were 11? Very protective parents." And, of that generation at that time, perhaps that was true. But when I started to wander off on my own, I started going to matinees. And, on my allowance, maybe once a month or so, I could go to a performance, and it hooked. And
Yep.
I became addicted to it very, very quickly. And, and whenever I tell a story like this, it's very important for the viewers or the listeners in this case to understand that at that time, there was nothing unusual about this.
I'm
That
going to
you would
fill in,
go.
sorry, a few commonalities.
Mhm.
One of them is that another equivalency was that in New York City, a subway token, which is how we used to get about, was
Hmm.
the same as the price of the New York Times and the same as the slice of pizza.
Correct.
All
The pizza slice economic equivalency. That's the famous one.
right.
And and that's the way. If people know about this at all, that's the one they know. But the concept extended to the arts as well, which was
Yeah.
really interesting. And that lasted until the 1970s. It was in the
Yep.
70s
We're going
when.
to get to the 70s. I put a place mark in 1977, just so you know.
Okay.
But another thing is when I was in kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher in Brooklyn, Miss Naifee, Naifee, they all were required to play the piano.
Hmm.
So she would bring us around the piano, and that's how we got our musical foundations. And I remember as if it were yesterday, the first piece we learned was by Brahms, and the
Hmm.
second was by Poulenc.
Right. And it's
Imagine
important to
a
note,
5-year-old learning Francis Poulenc.
and it's important to note that what you're talking about is in a public school.
Yeah,
And Fred, I'm sure you feel the same way that when I think back on my public school education in New York City, it was easily the equivalent of a major private school education today.
yeah,
And it was a gift of citizenship. My parents didn't have to worry about expenses, costs, tuition, whatever. The school buildings, not, actually, I'm thinking now about my elementary school. My elementary school was in a building that had been constructed in the 19th century, so the building was old,
mine
but
too. Yeah.
it was certainly clean and well maintained, and there were books for everybody, and all the urban public education issues that are faced by people today didn't really exist then. It was truly a gift of citizenship,
To
and
bring in a famous name, I went to PS 161 in Brooklyn in my
yeah.
earliest years.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned only recently the most famous graduate is Clive Davis, the very
Ah,
famous, legendary music producer. He
mm-hmm.
too went to PS 161. And if
Mm-hmm.
you look around Brooklyn, just to name Brooklyn, Woody Allen, Barbra Streisand,
Sure.
Norman Mailer, all these people went to New York City public schools. And
Yes.
the same in the
Yes.
Bronx, same in all the boroughs, Regina Resnick in the Bronx, Roberta Peters,
Right.
all these people,
Right.
Risa Stevens were all Bronx girls. And, all of them got the same foundation that you and I
Yes.
got later
Yes.
on. And
And
it is a remarkable thing and something that I frankly believe we have to get back to. We will get back to it a little later. But what was the first Broadway show you saw? Do you remember?
yes, The Music Man. It was
Uh-huh.
the end of the original production, 1961. So I was 11 years old,
Yep.
and it was at the Broadway Theater. It had moved from the Majestic to the Broadway, and the first three shows that I saw, I was taken. With Music Man, my parents took me to a Saturday matinee. And then there was a revival of Showboat at City Center, and I
Yep.
went with a friend's family to that. And the third was a Saturday matinee of My Fair Lady, also near the end of the original run.
Wow.
And my brother took me to that. But then, having had now three shows under my belt, after that I was on my own,
Yeah.
and frequently went to the theater. I'm 12, 13 at this point, and would frequently go on my own. I was just reading Mark Harris's excellent biography of Mike Nichols,
Yeah.
and um, and I'm thinking, I remember seeing the original production of Barefoot in the Park and The Odd Couple, directed by Nichols, and
Wow.
sitting, basically by myself in the balcony of the Biltmore Theater, or in other Broadway houses, and again, there was nothing unusual about that. Those balconies, especially at matinees, were packed with kids,
With
and
kids.
yeah, they
My
were
first was
who were
Gypsy. I
not
was
being
taken.
taken. The important thing about all of that was that it was a very independent adult thing to do. You were not being taken by your families.
Right.
You
No, I
were
know.
there on your own.
My first was Gypsy with Ethel Merman, the original.
Yeah,
My second was Oliver.
yeah,
Then I saw a play, The Royal Hunt of the Sun.
right. Peter
Then I
Schaff.
saw Hello Dolly and Fiddler on the Roof. To those I was taken. My first on my own was Henry Sweet Henry, which played at the Palace Theater
Alice.
and
Donna
starred
Michi.
Donna Michi and my cousin Alice Playton. And after that, I was on my own, and I went to cabaret on my own. I didn't quite understand it at the age of 9 or 10, but I got enough of it to understand that it was a good musical. And I
Mhm.
too, I went to Zorba. I went to all the plays and musicals and built up my cultural knowledge, not necessarily by reading the plays, although I did that too. But if
Mhm.
there was a Chekhov, I would go see it, whether there was a star or not. I didn't know stars. I
Right.
can tell you without reservation that my first crush in terms of a performer, and she remains a crush, is Colleen Dewhurst, and
Whom I knew
an
quite
actress.
quite
You
well.
knew her?
Oh yes. Colleen, she was marvelous. She was a really marvelous person. Very earthy, totally
Yeah,
accessible. I never met her husband, George C. Scott.
Lucy Scott.
He's
Yeah,
married twice.
yeah.
Um, but so I never met him, but I had done some work with Colleen as well. I really adored her. But Fred, you should
Well,
mention, if you have not on other broadcasts,
yeah.
that your cousin Alice Playton made a very important Metropolitan Opera debut.
We'll get to Alice a bit later if you wish.
Okay.
But because that was actually my first performance of anything, was
Okay.
being taken to see Alice. Um, I was not quite 3
Really?
when that premiered. It was March of 1959. I'm born in May.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I was not quite 3. But Colleen Dewhurst was the person who awakened me to the fact that perhaps you don't only go for the show with the playwright, but you go for the performer. And I had seen Ethel Merman and Georgia Brown and Carol Channing and a lot of these great, great performers. And I certainly love Carol Channing. But
Mm-hmm.
it was Colleen Dewhurst who made me say, I'm going to follow this performer for her art, her
Mm-hmm.
artistry,
My
before opera, before anything. And that to me
yeah.
was the breakthrough.
My equivalent to that was Rosemary Harris
Ah, yeah.
and a marvelous English-born actress, still alive, thank God, who had, she's now retired, but her New York stage career lasted well over 50 years,
Endlessly.
and
And she was
brilliantly.
recently in a revival of My Fair Lady as Mrs.
She replaced
Pickering.
Diana Rigg in the Lincoln Center revival of
Right,
My Fair
right.
Lady.
Yeah.
So anyway, the moment, I mean, this is my version of what you just said with Colleen. There used to be long ago a repertory company in New York that was based in the Lyceum Theater on Broadway called the Association of Producing Artists, or the APA.
Mhm.
And Rosemary Harris at that time was married to the artistic director of the APA, Ellis Rabb.
Yeah.
And she was the leading lady of that company, basically. And I can vividly remember being in the second balcony of the Lyceum Theater watching the APA production of A School for Scandal of Sheridan, classic British play. And I did not know that there's an epilogue to The School for Scandal. So we go through the third act, curtain comes down. I'm assuming at my very young age, now the curtain is going to go up and there'll be a curtain call. But no, the curtain goes up and Rosemary Harris does the small monologue that is the epilogue to The School for Scandal.
Ah.
And I can still hear her voice in my inner ear. She did that with such brilliance and such perception and such reality, because the epilogue is meant to be performed by the actress who is playing Lady Teasel, the
Mhm.
main female role in School for Scandal. So you're watching Rosemary Harris in the epilogue play the actress who is playing Lady Teasel. So you have these 3 levels to it. And I'm 14, 13, 14, whatever. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, oh, this is bigger than I thought it was.
Mm.
And this realization through her performance that there was a whole other dimension to this thing beyond the pleasure of a production. It was essentially an introduction to the art of this. And it's very curious. Just a few years ago, the wonderful director Jack O'Brien published a memoir. And there's a section in it where Jack talks about being a student at the University of Michigan And the APA is, they used to have a residency at that university. And he's a student, he's an undergraduate, and he's actually working as an usher or something else in the theater where they're performing. And he watches Rosemary Harris do the epilogue to the School for Scandal, and the same thing happens to him.
Mm.
Watching that moment of that actress give that performance, it opened up a whole world to him from which none of us, have ever returned.
Yeah. Was there a playwright early on where you heard his or her language and writing and said, I have to see everything by this playwright?
Um, yeah, actually, I would say it was Pinter. It was
Uh-huh.
when the original production of The Homecoming came to, that would
Why?
have been 67 or 68, I guess. The original Royal Shakespeare Company production with Paul Rogers and Vivian Merchant, who was then Mrs. Pinter and all. And and there was a lot I learned from that. And I remember sitting in the balcony of the Music Box Theater on Broadway and being but completely riveted by The Homecoming and these performances, and also learning something about the nature of live performance, because I remember that in the row in front of me there was a family, and they were bored out of their minds, and they just hated it, and I'm sitting there having a revelation. And these are the building blocks of it doesn't matter if you're a professional within the arts or if you're just an attentive audience member. Those are the experiences where you learn how the game is played, and you learn what the nature is of live performance and the sort of call and response in live performance, and why it's so different from a film or watching something on a screen for that matter. And how a performance, whether it's opera, theater, ballet, it doesn't matter. Everything is altering minute by minute according to the audience response. And I'll never forget this family having the exact opposite reaction
Mhm.
to The Homecoming from what I had. But in New York at that time, there was another wonderful stage director who's maybe a bit forgotten unfairly, Alan Schneider.
Yeah.
And New York in those years was the epicenter of Samuel Beckett performances worldwide,
Mhm.
because Alan lived here and Alan was Beckett's preferred stage director. And Alan did all of the original productions of the major Edward Albee plays with Pinter. Now, he didn't do The Homecoming, that was Peter Hall. But the American productions of the early Pinter plays were all done by Alan. And the fact that we had this internationally connected stage director that playwrights of that stature trusted,
Mhm.
uh, added a whole extra dimension to international theater in New York that we don't have today. Alan is really missed, really missed.
I said you had a placeholder in 1977. I'm going to open it now. I remember I was living in Europe for most of the 70s, but I happened to be here for a little while in 1977. And I remember that Liza Minnelli was announced for a new musical called The Act.
Mm-hmm.
And the all the papers were buzzed with the fact that the top price in the orchestra would be $25. And how could they do that?
Well,
And
that was
how
a lot
is
of
that?
money at that time. That was
Was
a
a lot
very,
of money. But I
yes.
mean, now recently they announced the prices for Denzel Washington and Jake Gyllenhaal in Othello. $800 was was the
Well,
top price.
the economic system is completely different now,
Yeah.
and you've dated it pretty accurately, because what happened what happened was that the radical increase of ticket prices was a strategic economic move that was made by theater owners in the Broadway world in the late 1970s. And as we'd said earlier, prior to that, the arts in New York were incredibly affordable. I mean, really,
Hmm.
and there were no economic barriers. And it extended to the visual arts as well. Most of the museums were free.
Great. Yep.
Um, And then in the 70s, when New York, the 70s was a great artistic, creative period for New York City. A lot of wonderful work was happening here, but it was a terrible time for New York City, economically, sociologically, all sorts of awful things were going on in New York at that time. But ironically, it was a wonderful time for the arts. But in terms of the need to sell tickets, that yin and yang between a very troubled city and a very creatively successful art scene was creating tension. And within the commercial Broadway theater, there was one of the leaders of the Broadway world is a man named Bernie Jacobs.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacobs started to think about the economics of all this and proposed breaking away from the traditional economic structure of Broadway ticket pricing, where he felt, and it was proven to be correct from an economic point of view, that Broadway tickets were wildly underpriced, and that for a hit, not for other shows, but for a hit, people would pay much, much more than they had been paying. And Jacobs proposed that if the ticket prices were radically increased, not having nothing to do with inflationary costs or labor, just increase the ticket prices, what would happen over time was that the number of productions would drop precipitously. And at that time, there were about 60 Broadway productions. And in fact, volume dropped by about 50%. Today, there are about 30 Broadway productions every year. So he said, volume will drop. And all of the small productions that might run a season and make a little money or lose a little bit of money, but keep a lot of people employed, all that would go away. He was right. And he said, but for the hits, if you maximized your income, because people will pay unprecedented high ticket prices for the hits, you would make more money out of the theater than anyone ever imagined could be made in the theater. And he was right. And that came in starting in the 1970s, as you said, where at the beginning of the 70s, the top ticket price on Broadway was something like $9. And then it moved fairly quickly to 15. Then it went up to 25. And then over the decades since, we're now at these astronomically high ticket prices, where a show with a major star will be capitalized to earn its investment back over a 4-month period of time. And the Bernie Jacobs theory from the 1970s, long ago, has been proven true in that for a hit or for a major star, a sufficient number of people will pay preposterous sums of money to have that experience as a kind of event. And those productions, those hits will make money and will make a substantial amount of money, not only for the people who've invested in those plays or musicals, but in the theater owners who are
Yeah.
running real estate.
And Bernie Jacobs was part of one of the big three theater owning groups.
He was co-director of the Shubert Organization.
Yeah. And the others are the Nederlanders and what used to be called Hugh Jamson, but I think it's changed the name now. Yeah.
Now Ambassador Theater Group. Right.
Ambassador Theater Group.
But there is a profound negative element to all of this.
Yes.
And the first thing that happened by radically increasing these ticket prices was that what I spoke of earlier, that we had no economic barriers, there was an enormous working class audience, that went away too. And the audience backbone of the Broadway theater up to that point had been people from Brooklyn or the Bronx who got on a subway and went down to Times Square, whatever, and that was gone, to be replaced by a tourist audience.
Yeah.
Because I can say for myself, if I'm traveling to Europe, I'll pay ticket prices there I would never pay in New York. It's only while I'm on vacation that I would pay a price like that for event programming. The Broadway theater reoriented itself away from New Yorkers and towards tourists, and tourists will spend more money. And now something like, I think less than 20% of the Broadway audience is from New York City.
Yeah.
When you include the suburbs, it goes up to about 45%, something like that. and the rest of it is all tourism. And the other thing that was diminished by the ticket prices, and this affects things like the Metropolitan Opera, is that it became economically impossible for most people to attend the performing arts in New York City as a matter of habit.
Yep.
So that the idea behind any repertory situation, doesn't matter if it's theater, ballet, opera, whatever, is that you're going to keep coming back. You're going to
Let's
see
define. I think it's important we define repertory. I think you and I know exactly what that is.
And repertory is when a producing organization, let's say ballet, all right? The ballet company has a production of Swan Lake. They may not do Swan Lake every year, but they're going to be doing it maybe every other year. And if you're a subscriber, you'll come back. You're going to see the same production of Swan Lake, maybe different dancers, but you're going to keep coming back. And that's an important part of maintaining a company, maintaining the choice of ballets, or again, operas, plays, whatever it's going to be. And it's built upon the assumption of a habitual audience that's dealing with works that keep coming back. So in order to keep coming back, you have to be able to afford to come back. And if you can't afford to come back, then the system keeps changing and it turns into event programming where you'll only go once or twice as opposed to monthly. And it completely alters the nature of the audience, the relationship to the work on stage, the assumptions of what the producing organization happens to be. Everything starts to change as a matter of just cost. Now, of course, there are inflationary costs as well. In any producing entity, there are expenses that you have now that didn't exist in those days, like information technology, and all of which is extremely expensive. So it's not as though you can just turn back the clock in some way. That's preposterous. Mm-hmm. But the entire art scene has been reoriented towards a high ticket exclusive enterprise that almost did not exist when you and I were starting out.
And baseball as well. Everything. You grew up in the Bronx. I happen to be a fan of the Bronx baseball team in New York City, not the other one.
Okay, good for you.
The other one is fine, but I am a Yankee fan 100%.
All right, there you go.
And also baseball, which used to be a passing down from fathers to sons, and now fathers also to daughters, and mothers to daughters and sons, from parents to children. It was a legacy as much as going to the Philharmonic was a legacy and learning about these things. And that's been cut off as well. Rob, I want to bring up something that I consider very important. And because we are contemporaries, I want to know your experience. When you and I were boys and we were going to these different arts events, mm-hmm. and we felt at home in these theaters, and they were very welcoming. They were a little run down, some of them, but they're very welcoming. Mm-hmm. And also Carnegie Hall, City Center, right. The Town Hall, a wonderful place on 43rd Street. These were all venues, plus all the Greenwich Village, the so-called off-Broadway mm-hmm. and off-Broadway, Cafe Chino, the mm-hmm. Ridiculous Theater Company. There were all these places that we went to and acquired a very diverse education and background. But I became at least at home in the buildings. And the buildings were as much a part of the experience as what was on the stage. Mm-hmm. And I remember vividly, because by then I was working at the Metropolitan Opera as a very young man, that then Mayor Koch decided that what would be best for New York City's economic problems was to destroy 3 theaters, the Morosco, the Helen Hayes, and the Roxy, which formed a nucleus on 45th Street, which is the street in New York City that had the most theaters and was the least crime-ridden of all. And to replace that with a gargantuan hotel from Atlanta with either driveways or elevators, they kept people off the street. Right. And people in the arts then demonstrated. I don't know if you joined that demonstration, but we formed a link and we were lined up alphabetically. So I had Bernadette Peters on one side and Christopher Reeve on the other side, and I'm Plotkin in the middle. And all of us were documents, and ultimately we were moved away, and there were demonstrations. Like Carnegie Hall was effectively saved by Isaac Stern and others. We could not save those three theaters. And when you and I know that the old Metropolitan Opera House was knocked down and
Hmm.
replaced by a greenish building with a giant needle and thread outside.
Right.
And, it's not, we walk past, and, we're not ancient, but we
Hmm.
walk, and we're still walking, but we walk past these places, and they're the ghosts of the buildings that
Oh,
were there.
totally.
And
Totally.
I remember especially the Morosco. It was the
Hmm.
theater more than any other that presented plays, and more Pulitzer Prize winning plays were done there than any other.
A
And all
lot
my
of
Colleen Dewhurst were there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of this has to do with changing sensibilities and urban planning in a way.
Yeah.
When the John Portman Hotel went up in Times Square, that was a direct response to the dangers and the deterioration of Times Square. And you mentioned Mayor Koch, and it was part of city policy to make that happen because it was believed it would help cure the ills of Times Square. And the sacrifice, especially the Morosco Theater, which was a perfect building
Oh.
for what it was, and also the Hayes, which was a pretty good building.
And
Um,
Helen Hayes was still alive.
He's still alive, correct,
Oh,
correct. And one of my mentors, Joseph Papp, was the leader of the protests that you were a part of. So the value of those theatrical buildings was replaced by the urban planning necessity of doing something about Times Square. But here's an example of how times changed. Across from the old Metropolitan Opera House, which was on Broadway between 39th Street and 40th, just south of Times Square, directly across the street from that was the Empire Theater. And the Empire Theater was considered the perfect Broadway house.
yep.
And like the Morosco, any number of wonderful plays, an incredible number of great performers that appeared there. It was a theater that had a theater building that had incredible emotional resonance. And it was torn down in 1953. And when it was torn down in 1953, I gather, there was very little resistance. It was just progress. And a skyscraper, is going to go up on the site. And people thought, well, okay, the empire had run its course, and that was the end of it. And the empire, at one point, the empire was renovated by Carrere and Hastings, the same Gilded Age architectural firm in New York that had renovated the Metropolitan Opera around 1900. And because those two theaters were across the street from each other, the Empire had echoes of the Carrere and Hastings renovation of the Metropolitan Opera. They had mini versions of the chandeliers and lighting fixtures that were in the anyway. When the Empire came down, apparently there was just no fuss, no bother. If the Empire had somehow lasted another decade, it probably would not have been torn down because by that time New York had landmarks, landmark preservation laws, and times had changed. But in each of these cases, part of it has to do with what the building itself was. The Morosco, the demolition of the Morosco was tragic because it really was a major theatrical building. Carnegie Hall, I mean, the perfect building for what it is. So it was not just a matter of the economics and the cultural threat and Isaac Stern's incredible advocacy for it, but you were dealing with a perfect building. The old Metropolitan Opera House on 39th Street was actually a horrible building that was constructed in 1883 as a temporary building. It was never meant to last as long as it did. Now, it was unbelievably historic. It was, I mean, every square inch of it had atmosphere and history, but it was a building in order to have saved the Met as a functioning building, a fortune would have had to go into rebuilding it. And in many, many ways, it was not a viable structure by 1966. So that made it more of a target than Carnegie was. Carnegie was a really savable physical structure, and the
But
old Met.
also, the Metropolitan Opera Association is actually a real estate company.
Yes, Well,
and
and
it's not an
originally,
opera
yes,
company.
that's right. Yeah,
And
you're absolutely
they
right about that.
sold the land to help finance the arrival at Lincoln Center. We'll get to Lincoln Center later. And I do want to tell people, by the way, that Rob and I are talking about theater and plays, musicals. Rob and I know each other primarily through opera
Yes.
because that's where we met. That's where I worked. And you have a Metropolitan Opera poster behind you. I have the same one on the wall in the other room,
There are two. There are
the
two
red
there.
one.
Yeah, and
and
the two Chagall posters.
and it's that's our common love. But
Yes.
I'm pointing this out because two boys can grow up in New York from poor or working class families, get this completely free exposure, nearly free exposure to the arts, meet people who can influence us if we are open to it. And you mentioned the name just now that I will tell you briefly how I met him, and then I'd love to know more about him, Joseph Papp. I
Hmm.
met Joe Papp in December of 1980.
Hmm.
And I was a graduate student then at Columbia University's journalism school. And we all had to do a master's project, which was not a thesis, but sort of a large scale, either article or documentary. And I was doing it on the history of the newspaper Variety, which that year turned 75, and its impact on the English language, on entertainment, and specifically on the New York theater and arts community. But I'll be blunt. I was doing it also because it would open the doors to meeting Harold Prince and Joseph Papp,
Hmm.
Billy Eckstein, Lena Horne, all these people that I always, Colleen Dewhurst, that I wanted to meet to interview them for my master's project. And
Hmm.
maybe one of them could get me a job. And I did later wind up working at the Met.
Yeah.
But Variety that year turned 75. And Joe Papp, who was, you're going to describe him more than I will, a voluble man, a brilliant man, a heavy smoker. And I remember his cigars asphyxiating me when I was sitting there with him. Um, but fascinating, really fascinating, compelling, and inspiring and charismatic. And I only had that hour with him, but I still remember it as if it were yesterday. It was December of 1980. You just said that you were mentored by Joe Papp. Please talk about him.
Well, Joe, um, he was the leading theatrical producer in America from the 19 mid 60s to the mid 80s. Joe died in 1991. There's someone said to me wisely, you can't recreate Joe Papp because you can't recreate the America that created Joe Papp. And he was a tough, street driven Brooklynite, grew up in dire poverty. And the key to Joe getting out of poverty when he was a boy in the Great Depression in the 1930s was being able to walk into his neighborhood branch library for free, no economic impediments, and discovering books, discovering Shakespeare, and becoming ultimately obsessed with Shakespeare. And by the 1950s, he's a blacklisted, in the McCarthy era in America, he's a blacklisted stage manager. But he has this dream, and he has the dream that there should be a theater in New York where people could walk in and experience Shakespeare the way he walked into his neighborhood branch library in Brooklyn. And it would have to be free. And I mean, the saga of how Joe Papp created what was then called the New York Shakespeare Festival is a long, elaborate story. There are any number of wonderful books about this subject, but this dream came through despite tremendous resistance from the city government. Eventually, a theater was built for him in Central Park. I mean, it became a huge success, and then at one point he was affiliated with Lincoln Center. It was just an enormously productive, creative person. And I first met Joe around 1970, I guess. I was a student at NYU, the NYU campus in the Bronx, which no longer exists.
Ah.
But that's where I went to college. Um, and I was interviewing Joe for my college newspaper. And
How funny.
that was the first time I met him. But then I got to know him in the 1970s. At the beginning of in 1976, at a preposterously young age, I became the head of theater for the New York State Council on the Arts at the very end of the Rockefeller era. And it was through that that I really got to know Joe. And he had I mean, he had a huge impact on a gazillion people in this country
Yeah.
in terms of theater, in terms of his sensibility. It was a different time, but I mean, I would be thrilled if in 21st century terms we could somehow, with a contemporary sensibility, reconstruct what Joe Papp was about in terms of plays, producing artists. The man achieved so much, and the legacy is profound, really, really profound. And I was extremely fortunate in that there were two sort of key pillars to the alternative theater in New York. I'm not talking about the Broadway theater now, but in terms of the then thriving, very, very creative, not-for-profit theater in New York. One pillar was Joe Papp at the New York Shakespeare Festival, and the other was Ellen Stewart, who
Cafe
had
La
also
Mama.
come up from dire poverty and ultimately created La Mama. And most people, you were either in the Joe Papp circle or you were in the Ellen Stewart circle. And I was extremely fortunate in that I was in both.
So was
So,
I.
so I
Yeah.
got two of them. And they had, I mean, the three theatrical people when I was really young who shaped an awful lot of my thinking. Pap, Ellen Stewart, and then a Broadway producer who is still around, Manny Eisenberg, who
Yeah.
was one of my teachers at NYU. And Manny had a truly brilliant class every Friday afternoon about play production, and Manny's training had a big impact on me.
Um, I want to stick with Joe for a moment because there are many things. I'm just going to name a few titles: Hair, A Chorus Line, to name two, but many, many more that came out of the public theater as it came to be known.
Hmm.
And the public theater produced these things. Some went to Broadway, made a lot of money, and that helped fund a lot of the activities of the public theater and the Shakespeare in the Park in the summer. One of the things that he advocated for, but I think I, as a New Yorker, noticed it and it was fine, obviously, was that you could have a black or a Latino actor playing a Shakespearean role that was not a black role, like Two
Hmm.
Gentlemen from Verona, for example. You could have white women and black men or black women and white men playing lovers together. You can have Asian people. You had people from
Right.
everywhere. You had the first sense that someone might be gay, but not necessarily playing a gay
Everyone was
character.
mixed up together. We were all
Yeah.
mixed together.
And it
Yep.
was so wonderful because that was a mirror of New York City.
Yeah.
And so it
Yeah.
did not feel like, God help me, the Royal Shakespeare Festival, which had people speaking in certain drama school
Hmm.
ways. And they were wonderful, of course. And we loved hearing the Oliviers and the Richardsons and the Gielguds and all those people. The Peggy Ashcrofts, I loved them all and I would watch them all.
Hmm.
But it was more exciting to me to see Colleen Dewhurst and James Earl Jones together, who we recently lost, James Earl Jones.
Yes.
Um, and in the most normal, Jane Alexander and James Earl Jones. Jane
Hmm.
Alexander going on to head the National Endowment for the Arts.
Hmm.
These were people who were all born in that era, of that era, artistically. And we are richer and stronger as a city for that. I remember my first Shaw play, I
Hmm.
maybe Joe produced it, I'm not sure, was um, St. Joan, starring Diana Sands.
That was at the Beaumont at Lincoln
The
Center.
Vivian Bowman Theater, Lincoln Center.
That was Repertory Theater of Lincoln Center. That was before Joe was still downtown at that time.
Okay, because
Yep.
I had asked you before what playwright grabbed you. Mine was Shaw
Okay.
and also Ibsen, but first Shaw. And I wanted to see everything by Shaw and derive his lessons. And, he was very polemical in the best ways, and there were no easy answers in his plays. But he made you think, but he also made you laugh.
Hmm.
And that to me was a very congenial combination. And all of these Shaw plays were coming in later on, not necessarily at Lincoln Center. You would have Rex Harrison and Claudette Colbert on Broadway playing
Those
Shaw.
were mostly Circle in the Square.
Yeah,
Uh,
sir, you're right on 50th Street. And Lanford Wilson downtown at the old Circle of the Square.
Yes.
But it was common in the New York Times. They would, in the past, have sort of a big box, and alphabetically the plays would be listed.
The
And I would
eighth.
circle the ones I had seen. I would put an X through the one or two I had no interest in seeing. And then I would put a check mark on the ones that I still had to see.
Mm-hmm.
And usually, if I was good, I saw three-quarters of everything in that grid at a
Mm-hmm.
time when there might be 40 or 50 shows on it. And
And you could afford to see them.
and I was going to say, I spent $3, and I was by then living on 66th Street and
Mm-hmm.
could walk to the theater district as a kid. I was
Yeah.
no longer in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the subway issue was gone, and I go to matinees. And this brings me around now to the fact that 66th Street, when I was growing up, I saw them building Lincoln Center.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I met at Lincoln Center. Lincoln Center right now is going through a lot of transition. I'm not thrilled with everything. Um, Originally, it was intended, it looked like an acropolis to me of the arts. It was very beautiful. It was made of travertine marble. It was styled after the Campidoglio, the Capitoline Hill in Rome. And um, all three buildings, the Met, the New York State Theater, and what was then called Philharmonic Hall 62, State Theater 64, the Met 66, um, were on a central piazza.
Mm-hmm.
There was a fountain in the middle that
Yes.
approximated where Michelangelo built in Rome the plinth for the statue of Marcus Aurelius. And in some ways, you felt like you were in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
but it was not forbidding for the most part. Behind the Met was the loading dock on Amsterdam Avenue, and beyond that were brown buildings that were New York City public housing. And I
Correct.
lived a block north of those, not in fancy buildings, but I lived a block north.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, they were mostly Latino and to some degree Black, and some Irish and Jewish and
Mm-hmm.
Hungarian living in those buildings. And I remember hearing a Black child say, because we went to school together, that the brown buildings were for the brown people and the white buildings, Lincoln Center, were for the white people. And I said to her, I don't think so. And I took her across the street and I took her to performances, and I started telling her that Lincoln Center was designed, the main building, so that all the three buildings had terraces. And you'd come out of the intermission, everything would be lit up, and you could see everything going on. And 10,000 people would be going to an arts performance every night at somewhere at Lincoln Center, which expanded to have the Lincoln Center Theater, which is Vivian Beaumont, Mitzi Newhouse. Now
Mm-hmm.
the Claire is at Tau or Toe, I don't know. Toe.
They're toe.
Um,
They're toe.
and Alice Tully Hall for chamber music and the Juilliard School that went up, a band shell. It continued to grow beautifully and in travertine, but it also had a sense of spaciousness about it. It was a refuge from the noise of the city. And the North Plaza had a Henry Moore fountain in a large pool. It was
Mm-hmm.
big enough, I mean, not fountain, sculpture, to accommodate the sculpture. Um, in the middle there, and we'll get to it later, is the magnificent library for the performing arts that to me was a sanctuary and still is. Um, the South Plaza had a band shell. The Big Apple Circus would come there. Lincoln Center was very vibrant, but it didn't feel like everything had to be shoehorned into every available bit of space.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening right there now for me is it's so crowded and it's become kind of a facility that it's lost its sense of being welcoming because everything's being built on top of it and around it. It originally was conceived to be urban redevelopment for the neighborhood. Around most of it, these massive buildings went up so that Lincoln Center is now dwarfed.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who lived behind there, many of them were thrown out. And this was very badly done. They belong in the neighborhood. It was known as San Juan Hill. And those people, just the way you were talking about theater before, excluding the working classes who have as much right, in my view, to the arts as everyone else does, um, a similar thing happened there. But I'm not, and the Film Society came in, all kinds of things came in. And I'm not necessarily asking you to comment the way I did on the development or the evolution, although you may. But what did it mean to you as a young man, a boy, really, going to these places where, yes, we could hear the Philharmonic, the Mostly Mozart Festival in the summer
Mhm.
for $8 because the theater was air conditioned. There was no air conditioning around. And I'd go hear Mozart to cool off.
That's all true. That's all
Yeah.
true. I
Talk
mean,
about your Lincoln Center as a boy and a young man.
well, like you, I do remember it under construction. And I remember being in high school at the Bronx High School of Science and
Did you go to Bronx Science?
Bronx Science, yes.
So did I.
You did? What year?
Yes. Huh?
What years were you there? I
I
graduated.
graduated in 73.
Oh, so you were after me. I graduated in 68.
Okay.
So I remember writing a paper about Lincoln Center while I was in high school. Anyway, it felt fascinating, new, it was accessible. Again, the something worth mentioning is that if a Broadway theater had a base price, cheapest price of $3, then when the Vivian Beaumont Theater opened at Lincoln Center, which is the legitimate theater drama house that's there. Well, that was one of those newfangled not-for-profit tax-exempt theaters, so that meant it had to be even cheaper. So you could sit in the balcony of the Beaumont for $2, a third
Mhm.
cheaper than the cheapest on Broadway. This has no bearing on contemporary life in the theater today. But if if the if a ticket to I mean, I also saw Diana Sands, a marvelous black actress who died young, unfortunately.
Yep.
I saw her do Saint Joan there. So you could see Diana Sands do Saint Joan in the brand new Beaumont Theater at Lincoln Center for a third cheaper than the cheapest seat on Broadway. I mean, this doesn't exist anymore. Um, and I remember as a high school student when the library, I mean, decades later, I became the director of the library at Lincoln Center.
Yep.
But going in as a high school student, it was a remarkable place to have all that information and all that stuff accessible to you. And I mean, and every generation has a variation on this theme. But when I think about all the incredibly great performances that I saw there in those years. Of course, Balanchine was still alive.
Hmm.
So I saw firsthand
Let's say who he was: George Balanchine, Mr.
George
B,
Balanchine, the greatest
head of the
choreographer.
New York City Ballet.
And and the dance field in New York at that time was going through what you can only describe as a kind of Elizabethan era because you had Balanchine, you had Jerome Robbins, you had Paul Taylor, you had Martha Graham, you had Merce Cunningham, you had so many people. They're all here in one city at the same time. And I think the dance community is still trying to figure out, so what are we now that this Elizabethan era has passed? But for people of my generation, we were there in what was then called the New York State Theater at Lincoln Center for one incredible Balanchine premiere after another. And you can do that in any of those buildings, whether it was Pierre Boulez's time at the New York Philharmonic or the unbelievable star system at the Metropolitan Opera that still existed in the 60s and 70s. And it just keeps branching out. And the fact that that was accessible was an amazing thing. But while you mentioned San Juan Hill and what is now a very commonly told story of the neighborhood, a Black and Latino neighborhood being destroyed for the construction of Lincoln Center. There's a certain element of mythology that has entered into all of that, but even accommodating the mythology of it, because that neighborhood was largely gone by the time Lincoln Center was even conceived, and we can get into that if you want.
And it
But
was also a lot Irish,
yes,
very Irish. Yeah.
exactly. If you
Yeah.
check the 1950s census, that neighborhood is 75% white.
Yeah.
Um, the core of what was referred to as San Juan Hill was actually displaced by the public housing project, the Amsterdam houses,
Right.
that were constructed for returning veterans from World War II. That's really the core element that destroys the neighborhood that had been there before. And that was before there was such a thing as Lincoln Center. But getting back to it, Lincoln Center was welcoming and accessible to me, no question of it. But the first person I ever spoke to who was enraged by the architectural message sent by the back of Lincoln Center on Amsterdam Avenue facing those housing projects, the person who was the most enraged by that was Joe Papp.
I was about to say, I'll bet it was Joe Papp, yeah.
And I will never forget having this conversation with Papp, where he just hated the back wall of Lincoln Center, and that he wanted, and Lincoln Center is now planning to spend $500 million, excuse me, to correct this back wall design of Lincoln Center to make it more opening, more of an open, welcoming site for people on the west side of Lincoln Center. But back in the 1970s, Papp was railing about that very issue. So it's something that does go way back. But you know, when you think about the destruction of the neighborhood, whether it's for the Amsterdam Public Housing Project or for Lincoln Center, if you go, you sort of have to put a lot of this in the historical context of its time. So all this is happening after World War II. And there's this tremendous sense in America of optimism. The war has been won. Rationing is over. We're going to create, and Lincoln Center is actually created as a political statement against the godless communists, you know, and we're going to show off American culture and all the rest of this stuff. And that neighborhood, if you go back into architectural histories of New York, not arts histories, but architectural histories, the residential buildings in that area, more than half of them were below code tenement buildings from the 19th century that did not have central heating or private bathrooms.
Yep.
If you lived in those buildings, there was a shared bathroom down the corridor,
yep,
but the apartments did not have bathrooms or central heating. And you would have a tub in the kitchen, you know, if you had a tub in the kitchen, things like that. So you can imagine the pressure on the New York City government to do something about this large substandard housing stock that was completely unacceptable for citizens in the post-war era. And that's an aspect of this thing that nobody ever wants to talk about. There was just within the social issues of that day, putting up public housing, creating Lincoln Center, even though there's no question, thousands upon thousands of people were displaced unfairly in many, many ways.
Yep.
But the pressure to do that in that sense of progress, whatever, but was also part of that progress was quite legitimate. Can't we create new housing where people will have bathrooms? Can't we do other things? And it's very easy to look back and completely question how this was done or the motivations behind it. And while some of the criticism is absolutely legitimate, there's also an element of mythology to it.
I agree. And just for definition, if people look at the New York City map, we're talking about west of Amsterdam Avenue.
Yes.
And from 65th Street south were these projects that were built. 65th to 66th was garages and things like that, service buildings. From 66th north to 70th, they built something called Lincoln Towers. These went up at the same time, and many of the people who were evicted, removed, whatever, came from that area north of 66. And Lincoln Towers was different because it was built by Alcoa, the Aluminum Corporation of America.
Yeah.
And many of the arts workers who worked at Lincoln Center, worked nearby, if they couldn't live in the Ansonia, which was fancier on 73rd Street, moved into Lincoln Towers. That's where my family moved. Because my mother worked at Lincoln Center starting in 1962, when it was just one building, one construction site. And I grew up, Lincoln Center was my playground. What was then Philharmonic Hall there were seven children who were who were children of Lincoln Center employees, and we were all 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, and there was no childcare available for us, so
Mhm.
we were put in the lobby of the new building, Philharmonic Hall, and one day this man in a cape and then not silver hair swept in. Who are these children? And the guard said, "Well, sir, these are the children of Lincoln Center employees. What are they doing in the lobby?" "Well, sir, this is the only place they can be." "No, it's not. Bring them into the auditorium." It was Leonard Bernstein.
Mhm.
So we seven became his focus group for his young people's concerts. And he would test stuff out on us, what
Mhm.
grasped and what worked as a concept, what didn't. And we would sit over his left shoulder and he would conduct, and then he'd turn around and talk to us and then talk to the orchestra. And this was our childcare.
Mhm.
And so
You're raising
yeah,
an important issue in this. You're raising
okay,
something
but let
very
me just
important.
finish. I loved theater, but it
Mhm.
was at this moment in 1962, 63 that I began to pivot toward what was happening at Lincoln Center and
Mhm.
away from imagining a career in the theater. I did briefly imagine that, but very soon my focus was on symphonic music, which I learned from Lenny, frankly, and from my beloved father. But then, given my love of theater, I found my way across to the Metropolitan Opera in 1966. And I was 10, and that's what changed everything for me in
Mhm.
terms of what I felt was my natural home, namely
Now,
opera.
there's another element in this that it's another one of these building blocks that doesn't exist today in the 21st century just because of security concerns.
Mm,
And it's what we all used to refer to as second acting. Because when we
yes.
talk about free, it used to be possible and it was sort of a universal activity that you would just walk into a theater at intermission and sit down. And you could walk into the Metropolitan Opera, you could walk into any Broadway show. And one of the groups of people I'm immensely grateful to are all the women, at that time they were all women, who were ushers in Broadway theaters.
Charettes.
We didn't use that word, but yes, more in the movie palaces they would say
Yeah.
usherettes, not so much in the theater.
You ate
Uh,
Raisinets and you had usherettes.
right, right. But in the Broadway theater, there were all these women who were the ushers, and for theater obsessed kids like myself, we all knew when every intermission took place, and you would show up at a theater and you would just walk in and sit down and you would second act. And as somebody once said to me, if you know somebody, you see the show for free. If you don't know somebody, you see the second act for free. And if you don't know somebody and you have to see the whole thing, then you buy retail. I have to. But
And while I have you, I'm just thinking of something else that you and I grew up. This is a wonderful walk down memory lane, Rob, because you and I, it's second nature to us now.
but
But
let me just, Fred, let me hold that thought because I
okay.
just want to say something else about the ushers. Never once was I ever thrown out, or did I ever hear of anybody who was thrown out?
Right.
And the fact that you could see the second act for free, and all those, they knew that we had just walked in. Of course they did, but
Mhm.
but nobody stopped you. And second acting was a very, very important way in which, as a young person, you would learn and study and learn about performance, learn about plays, learn about opera, learn about ballet, whatever. You could walk into New York City Ballet and okay, you missed the first piece that's on the program that night, but you'll see the second and the third part.
Right.
Fine.
You can see
And
Apollo.
and the
Yeah.
other thing is that in theater economics, things were not the profit loss factor of it was not built upon a theater being sold out. Essentially, if you played to about 70% of capacity, you
Yep.
were doing well, you were fine. And if 30% of the seats were unsold, you're still you're able to meet your payroll and the show will continue to run. And The one and only time in my life that I met the playwright Arthur Miller. He said to me that if you went back in the archives and you looked at the original runs, Broadway runs of plays like Death of a Salesman or Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, he said you'd see that they rarely sold out, maybe on a Saturday night. He said, but most of the time, those hit plays would play to about 70% of capacity.
Yep.
And that meant there was lots of room for people to walk in during intermission. And
That's right.
all this ended after 9/11 when security came in.
Yep.
And young people today can't second act performances the way we did and expand not just the pleasure of performance, but really what they're learning and absorbing
Right.
and learning how to train your eye and your ear in
Here's what I
all.
was going to ask you because it's a term and a phenomenon that is gone in New York, but
Mhm.
that you and I knew intimately, I'm sure. The twofer, TWOFER. What was a
Yes,
twofer? Where did you get one and how did you use it?
I remember twofers in my elementary school at PS7 in the Bronx. I remember seeing the teachers would have them.
Mm-hmm.
And they were these little paper coupons, and you could go to the box office and get two tickets for the price of one. I
Two,
mean,
four,
some
one.
would say that, okay, we have discount ticket booths and online discount ticketing services, and that there's an equivalent to that. And in a way, they're right. However, at a very high ticket price. So that in the middle of Times Square in New York City, which is the heart of the commercial Broadway theater industry, there's something called the TKTS booth, tickets booth, where people can line up and get half price tickets. And one time I was allowed to stand inside the booth and just watch the transactions as people came in. And they would ask for whatever the show title is, and the box office treasurer would say, "Yes, we have a ticket for that show." And the price is $125. And then the person buying the ticket would say, "Yes, what is it at half price?" And he would say, "Yes, that's what it is at half price, the $125." And they would be shocked. When you talk about twofers in those days, those little paper coupons,
Yep.
you would be seeing you would get like an orchestra seat to a Broadway show, not for $3, but maybe $4, or
The
$4.50
Zorba,
or something like that.
1968,
Yeah,
Kander and Ebb.
and again, we're talking about a completely different economic system, a
Right.
completely different system
But the
that has no
twofer would
counterpart
come
today.
in different colors, and I would collect the twofers because I
Yes.
love the colors. And they
Hmm.
looked like theater tickets, but they were
Yeah,
not theater tickets.
but they were
And
pastel colors. I
they were
remember.
pastel colors,
Yeah.
and you could find them in the Edison coffee shop, which was where
Right.
everybody wound up on 47th Street, in dry cleaners, everywhere there were in the
Everywhere.
theater district. And I would go walk down the theater district, go get a coffee, as they would say. Well, I was, a 10-year-old drinking coffee, and collect my twofers for the week and say,
Oh yeah.
okay, Barefoot in the Park. I've never seen Barefoot in the Park or Cactus Flower, or a show that I had heard of but couldn't afford called Company. I went
Yeah.
to the last performance of the original
Hmm.
Company, and I was
Hmm.
too young to really get it. I ultimately got it, but I didn't get it then.
Yeah.
But a year later, I went to see Follies several times. And it was just a year, and these were both Stephen Sondheim shows, but somehow Follies completely clicked for me
Yeah.
about what it all meant. And that's why 10 years later, when they were destroying the Morosco, the Helen Hayes, and the Roxy, Follies was about the destruction of the building and everything that goes with it.
Yes.
And
Right.
it had an impact on
Right.
me. So I'm going to tell you a story, Rob, because you mentioned something that I think will resonate with you a lot. I told you that my very first opera was Wozzeck when
Hmm.
I was 2 years and 10 months, and my father took me. And the reason was it was the Met premiere, um, and Herman Uda I think played Wozzeck. Eleanor Stieber I know played Marie,
Hmm.
and my young cousin Alice Plotkin, as she was then known, was in the Metropolitan Opera Children's Chorus
Hmm.
and was cast as Marie's child. And they cut Alice's hair short.
Hmm.
And she was such a sensation, along with everything about it, Dimitri Mitropoulos conducted, that
Oh, wasn't it Carl Burnham?
probably, I'm not sure. We'll
I
have
think
to check.
I think the Met premiere was Carl Burnham.
Okay, we'll check. And but I don't remember much about the opera. Wozzeck is a weird opera to take a baby to. But what I do remember was the sound of the applause. And I
Hmm.
remember the gold curtain, and I remember the enthusiasm, and I remember people crying, and the emotion that the audience brought to that experience. And it took a few more years when I got older to recognize that, Aida, Tosca, the things that I was, Magic Flute that I was taken to, that was more congenial for a kid learning opera. But I adored my father, and he took me, and we sat with my uncle, the father of Alice, and my aunt and cousins and so on. And in front of my dad was a rather tall man, prematurely bald. And in front of me, I knew this at not even 3 years old, was a gorgeous woman. And she turned around and caressed my cheek
Hmm.
and said, "Now be a good boy." And I was a very good boy. And I didn't make a sound during the opera, which was 90 minutes. And I remember the festivity of after, but I remember that beautiful woman. Fast forward to 1999, and I was in Chicago for the world premiere of William Bolcom's A View from the Bridge,
Hmm.
based on a play by Arthur Miller. And I got to ask him some questions. And I asked him a very basic softball question: what's the most memorable opera performance you ever went to? And he said, that was easy. Wozzeck, March 1959 at the Metropolitan Opera. I said, were you in row A? Yeah. And I said, my dad sat behind you. So that pretty woman who caressed me was Marilyn Monroe. He said, that's right.
Now
After that, I
mm,
couldn't ask him any other questions about A View from the Bridge, but
we've never talked about this before, but here's another thing in common. The opera that got me into opera in when I was in high school was Wozzeck.
really.
Yes, and I knew the play, and I I didn't even know how. I somehow found out that there was this musical version of it,
Hmm.
and I had been to a few operas. The first I once snuck into the old Met on 39th Street. I was going in as an audience was coming out at a matinee. That was the first time I was in the building during the last season of the
Ah,
old house. But then I did see a performance of Barbara Seville with Rary Grist, Luigi Alva, Siepi, and Corena.
which was, and I praised him which was early interracial casting.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
And I also saw Antony and Cleopatra and the new. So I'd been to a few operas at that, but I was not an opera person by any means. Um, and then I just go, oh, there's this version of Wozzeck. Let's try that. And the Böhm recording with Lear and Fischer Disco had just come out, and that was like the heavens opening. And I thought, oh my God, this could have been written for me. This could have been written for me. And people always think it's so, and I've talked about this on Met Opera broadcasts. A lot of people think it's insane that Wozzeck would bring people in, but I say it has never let me down. There are so many theater people
Hmm.
that they're curious about opera, they don't know anything about opera. And I said, try Wozzeck, and
Yeah.
they fall in love with it. And it is it's a surprising but extraordinarily effective way, a work, I should say, that can bring an uninitiated but theatrically oriented person into loving opera.
And by the way, Wozzeck was written by Alvin Berg about 1925.
Mm-hmm.
The Alice's nephew, when he was born, was named Albin for Alvin Berg.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And Alice, by the way, went on to a 52-year career in the theater.
Yes, right, right.
And part of the reason that I pivoted early on to Broadway was that she was in Gypsy. That was my first show as
Mm-hmm.
Baby Louise. Then she was in Oliver's Bet, and then Hello Dolly as Ermengarde. And then Alice took her own path that included a lot of off-Broadway and experimental theater and parody and song, and she was a great singer and so on. And up until the very end, she was performing, and she had a lot of illness, but she never missed a show and was known in the theater world very well as Alice Playton.
Yes.
Plotkin, Ethel Merman probably renamed her Playton. We never quite know. But
Okay.
Alice would stand in the wings and watch these great artists in the opera house, but also in the theater, and that's how she learned. You and I got to watch from the audience, but Alice, I later got to be in the wings, but Alice from the very beginning watched from the wings. Um, Now you mentioned the Metropolitan Opera broadcasts.
Hmm.
I don't quite know when you and I met, but I began working at the Met in late 81. I became performance manager in late 1982, and I
Hmm.
left February 6, 1988 as performance manager, but continued to do stuff at Met through the years and appeared on many broadcasts, you and I, radio broadcasts, you and I often did together. It used to be that you and I and Nibet Habashi and other people would
Hmm.
do, Father Owen Lee would do
Hmm.
essays in
Oh
addition to
yeah,
playing the opera quiz.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
love doing the essays.
I
Are
did
they,
two. I started out. I mean, it used to be if going on. I always thought of going on the quiz as sort of paying your dues. When I mean, the first thing I ever did for the Met Opera was around 1976 or 1977. I was the author. Here we go again. The Metropolitan Opera Student Guide to Wozzeck. And,
hmm
and what happened then was this is during when John Dexter, the great British stage director, was at the Met. And the Met used to do a series of student performances in the spring.
Yep.
And Dexter had this crazy idea. We should do Wozzeck as the student performances, which is actually a brilliant idea. And a lot of people thought, well, there was somebody at the Met who knew that I had had this transformative high school experience with Wozzeck. And I was making my way as a writer in New York at that time. And someone said, oh, he had this experience. Get him to write the book. So it was the very first time I had ever gotten a call from them. And I remember being told by people in the education department, you'll have an easy time with the kids. The teachers are going to drive you crazy.
Yes.
Um, but anyway, the little book worked out very well. The performances were terrific, and it was exactly as people had described. The student audiences were incredible in how they responded to Wozzeck, because by that time, by the 1970s, those kids have heard more difficult music and film scores. The language, the 12-tone
And
language.
dealt with issues in real life that
Absolutely, absolutely.
reflect what happens in that tragic opera.
The teachers were scared because they wanted
Yeah.
to have Barber of Seville, but the kids responded beautifully. Anyway, that was the very first thing I did. And then in the 70s, uh, there, there was some discussion in the late 70s about my becoming sort of the dramaturg of the Metropolitan. Nothing never came of that. And then in the 80s, I had some passing contact with the Met, but not much. But then in the 90s, everything changed. And when Patrick Smith became the editor of Opera News, Patrick asked if I would come in as the consulting editor. And then I started writing a lot for Opera News. And then everything started up again with the Met Opera.
hmm
And then when it was not what it was new, but there was a revival in 1995 of again of Wozzeck. And no, excuse me, it was Mahagoni. It was a revival of Mahagoni, and they needed someone
Like Kurt Weill. Yeah.
with Kurt Weill, right? And they needed someone to do a full intermission, sort of music and dramatic analysis on the air. And it was actually somebody else was going to be doing it who dropped out, and they needed somebody who knew Mahagoni backwards and forwards who could come in and do that broadcast. So again, convoluted set of phone calls. And I said, sure, I'd love to do it. So I went in, and they were very pleased with the way that worked out. And then they had me back. So then at a point, I'd say between 1995 and about maybe for 10 years, I had a connection to about half of the radio broadcasts, either as an on-air personality or as a ghostwriter or a quiz panelist. But my main assignment would usually be the first intermission feature, where either I would talk or I would interview somebody, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice in the U.S., who was also a major opera fan, and any
And by the
number.
way, listeners, I had her son James Ginsburg on this program back in July or early August, and you can find it on YouTube or on iTunes. Yeah.
record producer. So for about 10 years I did that, but then would pay my dues by appearing on the quiz every once in a while. Uh,
Um, Now, I never treat these conversations as walks down memory lane because opera is great now. They're wonderful singers now. Opera has changed. Theater has changed. Everything has changed. The buildings have changed. But I am a big believer that we're not supposed to forget what happened. We're
mhm.
just not supposed to lament that it's not the way it was. And there was a woman, I wonder if you ever met her, whose name was Eleanor Robeson Belmont, who was the
I
founder of the
never met her.
Metropolitan
Of
Opera Group.
course, I know. And
Never met her?
about Shaw. Of course, Shaw wrote Major Barbara for her.
Yes, exactly. And she was the founder of the Metropolitan Opera Guild in 1935, helped found Opera News magazine, was a lovely, gracious lady. And, I started young enough and she lived old enough that our lives actually intersected. And her funeral was at the Church of Heavenly Rest on Fifth Avenue, about 90th Street. And I
Mhm.
remember that basically it was all of opera, all of the arts, all of horse racing, because her husband, August Belmont, owned the Belmont Track and Stakes in Queens. It was a confluence of many New Yorks all at once. Yes, she was a British actress, um,
No, she
but
was American. She was not British.
she was American. You're right, but
She was
married
American. She was a very well-known actress named Eleanor Robeson.
Robeson,
Robeson.
Robson.
And she was American, but she also appeared in London. And Shaw wrote Major Barbara for her. However, she never appeared in it, even though he wrote it for her, because by the time the play was finished, she had married Belmont,
August.
August Belmont.
Yeah.
And of course, in those days, once you married into that kind of tremendous wealth, you had to retire from the stage, which Eleanor
Like
wrote
Melania Trump.
to become, but she became now Mrs. Belmont. And there's actually a wonderful interview with her when, she's still at this point, when she's at the beginnings of being Mrs. Belmont, she's still famous as Eleanor Robeson, even though
Yeah.
she's no longer working. And there's a reporter who asked her, because Belmont was principally a railroad baron, who
Mhm.
said, Mrs. Belmont, what is it like having a private railway car? And she looks at the reporter as it was written up and says, oh, having a private railway car is not an acquired taste. One takes to it immediately.
The reason I introduced her is
Mm-hmm.
that her memoir is one of my favorite books, and it has my favorite title. And I try to emulate the title in the kind of work I'm doing here for Idacho, The Fabric of Memory.
Mm-hmm.
And because I've loved it, we're not done yet, but I've loved having people like you on this show because we're building an archive, we're building a memory. And as I said to you, while all of the arts change and education changes, one thing that you were very instrumental in that I believe is a New York treasure, and I'd love for you to talk about as relates to the fabric of memory, is the Library of the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center, which to me, geographically, it's sort of tucked in between the Met
Yeah,
and the Beaumont, and you don't quite know what's there because it's just a little portal with a revolving door.
that's just
And
the
by
entrance.
correct,
It's actually a very large building.
it is,
And
I know, but you would never know from where it's
well,
placed there.
that's
But
because there wasn't enough money to build Lincoln Center as designed.
ah,
And as Philip Johnson, the architect who designed the State Theater where the ballet is, he
yep,
said the problem with Lincoln Center is not that it's too big; it's too small.
yep,
And originally, the Beaumont Theater that we mentioned earlier, that was going to be where the reflecting pool is, and the library, actually officially at that time, the Library and Museum of the Performing Arts, that was going to be the entire site where the Beaumont Theater and the library are now. And at that time, there wasn't enough money to build both the Beaumont Theater and the library. And Eero Saarinen, the architect of the Beaumont, went to Gordon Bunshaft, the architect of the library, and said, well, I don't have enough money and you don't have enough money. What if we merge these buildings
wow,
and we'll push the Beaumont back into the envelope of the library, and we can create something where sort of the library wraps around the theater in some way, and we'll have an open plaza. We can put a reflecting pool in the open plaza. It'll seem a little bit bigger, and maybe with a combined budget, we can put up this merged building. And that's with a lot of controversy. There actually had to be an act of the New York State legislature in order to make that feasible. But what happened, what was finally built is that the library and the Beaumont Theater building are a co-op where the library is 55% of the building and the Beaumont is 45% of the building. And the library, people think of it as very small because the entrance is small, wedged between the Metropolitan Opera House and the Beaumont. But once you're inside, it's true, as I said earlier, the library literally wraps all the way above and below and behind the theater. So that opened in 1965 as a sort of unprecedented facility in New York. There had been talk about creating a kind of performing arts museum in New York since the 1920s. And then as part of Lincoln Center, it became a reality where all of the performing arts archives of the New York Public Library would be merged into one location at Lincoln Center. There would also be a small theater put up there of just 200 seats, which ironically is to this day the only space at Lincoln Center that's named for a musician. That's the Bruno Walter Auditorium.
Yep.
And there would be space for exhibitions and all the rest of it. So this building was constructed. It opens with great fanfare in 1965. It is a fantastic thing. You and I both, even though we didn't know each other, it was a place where you would hang out. There were wonderful exhibitions. All you needed to do was just walk in the door. Again, no economic imperatives. You could borrow material. You could study things on site. It was really great. And then, as New
And they
York,
had turntables, and I could borrow a recording and
yes,
sit and listen to a
exactly.
recording. Yeah.
Because it was funded by the city of New York largely, when the city went into bad economic times in the 1970s, which we had mentioned earlier, that building began to be compromised. And the budgets were cut, and there was a point where it almost closed.
Mm.
And then, if we skip now to the late 1980s, I was then the head of theater for the National Endowment for the Arts in Washington. And I was leaving Washington, and there were board members of the New York Public Library who knew that I would be leaving the National Endowment for the Arts. And Betty Chapin, the wife of former Metropolitan Opera
Schuyler
general
Chapin.
manager Schuyler Chapin.
Who hired my mother at Lincoln Center.
All right.
Yeah.
So Betty had this crazy idea that I should come in and take this compromised library museum of the performing arts and totally reinvent it. And at first I thought, well, I have no background in libraries. What, and it took a little while, but we came up with this concept of making the Performing Arts Library as much like a producing organization as we could, essentially the place where the New York performing arts community goes to do its homework. And we thought, okay, we're going to make everything about this related to the production of theater, dance, and music without disturbing the librarians. Everything stays on the shelves, but the concept of the institution is going to change. And we launched that in 1989. I spent 10 years there, and it was it all worked out in the end. By the end of my time there, we had 400,000 people a year coming through those doors for either using the collections or coming for an exhibition, or we maximized use of that 200-seat performance space downstairs. It was a great time, and I think we realized the potential of that place in a way that had not been seen since it opened in '65.
Now, speaking of 1965, this is a natural transition. National Endowment for the Arts. Also, the New York State Council on the Arts. You were talking about it earlier. Did you know Kitty Carlisle Hart?
Oh, very well. I worked with Kitty.
So did I.
and I mean, I was at the New York State Council. Kitty Hart, an American actress who became the chair of the Arts Council at a moment when there was tremendous upheaval. The previous administration had been dismissed by the governor of New York at that time, Hugh Carey, and Kitty was the vice chair, and she was promoted to becoming the chair under very difficult circumstances, and she had to navigate that very, very, very skillfully. But I was there from 76 to 82, and
Mhm.
except for my first year, Kitty was chair for the rest of my tenure there.
And I met her in '82 when I was at the Met as performance manager. And I would like to point out that Kitty Carlisle Hart in 19, I think 35, starred with the other Marx, Groucho,
Yes.
and Harpo and Zeppo and Chico in A Night at the Opera, doing Leonora in Il Trovatore, kind of, sort of. And then she worked with Rob Marx.
This is true. But, you know, as long as we're on this subject, I'd like to mention another name.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily important, not only to me, but to the whole not-for-profit art scene in New York in those years. And this was Dorothy Rogers, the widow of
Yes.
Richard Rogers. And a lot of nasty things have been written about Dorothy Rogers in many, many books. And it's tragic because she was one of the great figures of the emerging not-for-profit art scene in New York, extraordinarily helpful and generous. And she was one of those people who there was a lot of trouble at home with her
Yeah.
daughters, within her family, but in her professional life, which included she was the chair of performing arts for the New York State Council on the Arts in those years, among many things that she did. And she was able to shape all these young people who are on staff at the New York State Council on the Arts, and also work closely with people like Pap or Robert Moss, who founded Playwrights Horizons, another important off-Broadway theater in New York. And as Bob Moss once said, if you needed something done, the person you went to was Dorothy.
Mm-hmm.
And Dorothy was sort of the second under Kitty Hart at the Arts Council. But if I've ever worked with anyone who stood for the right, the true, the just, and the good in terms of the arts, in terms of what an arts agency is supposed to be, in terms of how an organization like a government arts council should stand up for principle and creativity and not for political pressure, the person who formed the thinking of so many people of my generation was Dorothy Rogers. God bless her.
Good to know. About Kitty, I met her before, but really worked with her a lot from '82 on. And we remained in touch, and I would see her socially and politically because she was, in the best sense, I believe, very involved in politics, but very adept at navigating all waters, whatever the water was.
Mm-hmm.
And the last time I saw her, I always called her Kitty, but it was at the Metropolitan Opera. It was a December. I don't remember the year. And the performance was Rigoletto, and she was with her daughter, and I think she sat in row B 101 and 102. And I was in N1, so up the aisle. And when Rigoletto ended, she was coming up, and I don't know why I didn't call her Kitty. I said, "Mrs. Hart." She said, "Oh, hello, darling. How are you?" And I said, "I'm fine. How are you?" She said, "Much better than Gilda, darling, much better." And she died 3 weeks later. And she had a very brief illness. And that was the last time I
It
saw
happened
her.
very quickly. It all
Yeah.
happened very quickly. Yeah.
But she was singing at 96. But I mentioned 1965 because that was around the time that the United States formed the National Endowment for the Arts, and people like Dwight Eisenhower, Jacqueline Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, both parties were active in the formation of these entities. National
But
Endowment for the Arts.
you didn't mention the key name. The key name was Nelson Rockefeller.
Of course, Nelson Rockefeller.
And you know, people forget that the whole establishment of this relationship between the arts and government, with tremendous optimism in those years, it was a Republican initiative, and both the New York State Arts Council, which was the sort of the flagship enterprise, and then the spinoff, which was the National Endowment for the Arts. These were all controlled by Rockefeller staffers like Nancy Hanks and many other people. Rockefeller and the whole sort of Sun King world of Rockefeller in relation to the arts. That was the bedrock under which all this grew. And the original sin of the arts field was that everybody assumed that what Rockefeller was building, both within New York State and by inference, the federal government, people just assumed, oh, it will just continue to grow. And nobody prepared for the day when Nelson Rockefeller was no longer the governor of New York,
Right.
because it all fell apart at that point. And
I'll
then,
only add that the Rockefeller brothers, the David and Lawrence, and I'm leaving one out. Um, the Rockefeller family architect was Wallace K. Harrison,
yes.
and he designed the United Nations building and did the plan for Rockefeller Center
Mm-hmm.
and did the blueprint for Lincoln Center and did the Metropolitan Opera House. So
Right.
all of that was Rockefeller. And I point this out because I really don't believe that the arts belong to one party or the arts belong only to certain people. And at that time, many leading Republican as well as Democratic politicians and leading figures understood that the arts were for everyone. And but I mention this because the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts evolved at that point in the mid 60s and grew and changed. We don't have to go through all of that now. But you mentioned that you were head of the theater program.
Yes.
More or less when you left and came to New York was more or less when I left the Metropolitan Opera and went
Mm-hmm.
to the National Endowment. I never knew this about you and me. That never mind, we both went to Brock Science,
Mm-hmm.
but the head of opera then was named Carolyn Hellman and later Wayne Brown.
Mm-hmm.
They had a role which was called the site inspector. It was really an expert, an efficiency expert, who was sent by the endowment all around the country, except for the Northeast, because I'm a New Yorker, to assess the health, the strength, the weaknesses of many of the leading opera companies in America. And the rule was that I was not allowed to accept any work from these companies for 2 years, which I always abided by. But I was sent all over the country. So after working at the Met and having worked in Europe before and going back to Europe, the 90s for me was kind of like a paid scholarship to learn the opera scene in the United States. And I went to Cincinnati and Minneapolis and Seattle and Phoenix and Tucson and Dallas and Miami and West Palm Beach and Atlanta and Phoenix. And I think I mentioned Phoenix, San Diego, Los Angeles, Chicago a couple of times. And it was a fascinating thing because I got to see American opera and I
Mm-hmm.
got to see the value systems and how boards worked. And I couldn't bring my Metropolitan Opera training to bear on these companies because their budgets were different. Or let's say it was a city that had one very powerful figure like Los Angeles who didn't like opera, Dorothy Chandler. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how did a company grow in Los Angeles when it had such a big opponent? Whereas in San Francisco, it had a very long history. Cincinnati, long history. Chicago, longer but checkered history. And I mean, I didn't get paid a lot of money by the NEA, but what I loved was that I got this magnificent education in my 30s about
Mm-hmm.
the entire American opera scene
Yeah.
that I bring to bear to this day.
Well, that's what I had in beginning in 1976 when I went to work at the New York State Council on the Arts, because now I was responsible for state subvention of theaters all across New York State. And having graduated from the Yale School of Drama, I now had a second education in the economics of
Hmm.
the not-for-profit theater, from everything from Joseph Papp down to small summer stock theaters in Onondaga County. And I in 1985, I did something similar to what you described, because I was hired by the NEA. This is before I went to work there, some years before I went to work there. Um, I was hired to do a national study of the state of contemporary American opera in America, because what had happened was that I think in 1984, 85, it was a year when there was one new work, new opera in America produced coast to coast, border to border. The only new work produced by a professional opera company in America was Peter Schickele's Figaro Gets a Divorce. And the fact that that was it, in the whole country. And there was a lot of discussion of it. The NEA then hired me to do a study of what led to that and what might come out of that. So I spent the better part of a year traveling all over the United States, talking to opera producers, getting to know opera companies. Now, I was focused exclusively on the issue of new work, but it was a wonderful experience, and it led to my one and only experience appearing on CNN, because the study was released in Washington, and for 10 minutes it was a newsworthy thing. But it was a fantastic education in the issues of regional opera companies.
I have a couple more questions for you, although I know you and I could do this for Wagnerian length, but I just have a
But we
couple more
won't. We won't, Fred. Yeah.
now. One is, I know that in your office you have a drawing, a Hirschfeld drawing of Beverly Sills.
It's right here. I can tilt my computer,
If you
and
want, go right ahead.
it's right there. That is the original Hirschfeld drawing. I don't think I can make it any larger,
Yeah, I
but
can see
that's
the extended
Beverly
arms.
doing Manon at the
Manon by Jules Massenet.
Massenet, and it was one of her most successful roles at New York City Opera. And the foundation where I am today, the wonderful Fan Fox and Leslie R. Samuels Foundation, the founders of this place, the Samuels family, they were very close to Beverly,
That was my second question, but we're going to stick to the first question for now. Um, Fabric of Memory. Even though Beverly Sills died not all that long ago, there are
yes,
many, many people who don't know of her or remember her, or maybe saw her on public broadcasting with a red wig with Carol Burnett or Julie Andrews,
yeah.
but don't understand who this figure was, who I knew and you knew. Talk about her.
Well, Beverly was a homegrown star
Yeah,
from your borough in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn.
Um, she had she was, I guess she went to the New York City Opera as a house soprano in the 1950s and was known and very familiar in the New York market,
But she
but
was
not,
also a 3-year-old singing on the radio as Bubble
yes,
Silverman.
yes, all of that, and like Maria Callas, she had appeared on the Amateur Hour and as a child and all the rest of that stuff. But anyway, Sills was not taken all that seriously in New York until in 1965 when the New York City Opera moved to Lincoln Center, and in sort of a diva-dienst moment, she manipulated her way into a new production of Handel's Julius Caesar, thereby pushing out Phyllis Curtin,
Yes.
who had been the leading soprano of the New York City Opera, never appeared with the company again after this incident. But
Who
Beverly,
became a great teacher in Boston. Her birthday
yes,
was December 13th. I called her every year on her birthday, Phyllis
yes,
Curtin, because
but before that, and also before Phyllis Curtin's Metropolitan Opera career and all that, she
right.
was the star of the New York City Opera. Anyway, Beverly goes in and takes over Julius Caesar and makes the most of it and becomes a star overnight. And then,
By the way, Norman Traeger was Julius Caesar.
yes, Norman Traeger was Julius Caesar, and Sills becomes an American sensation and comes to symbolize opera in America. First as the star of New York City Opera, then as the general director of New York City Opera. Then she became the president of Lincoln Center and finally chairman of the board of the Metropolitan Opera. And Beverly was from that period, from the mid 60s into certainly through the mid 90s, maybe into the beginnings of the 21st century when she died. A leading cultural figure of New York, and a very important voice, a really, really important voice
When
for
you say
artists.
voice, as a singer or as a public
No,
figure?
as a cultural
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
I
she
mean,
retired from singing. She was around 51 or 52.
yeah, she was comparatively young in
And she sort of felt she had done that. She had a difficult personal life in that she had 2 children with disabilities. Her
yeah,
husband was well off, so that made it easier. But nonetheless, she always told me that she found joy stepping on the stage because she could step away from the realities of her life, which
mm,
loving mother, but nonetheless, it was not easy.
yes,
And
Yes, she once said that she would have given up her entire professional career if she could have had two healthy children.
Yeah. One of her daughter was deaf, and it
Yes,
was always so ironic that Muffy could not hear Beverly, her mother, sing
right.
when she sang that way. But Beverly Sills, I think it's fair to say, was an ambitious person, and
Yes,
she
and a diva in her own way,
she had
certainly.
sharp elbows.
Yeah.
Um, she could be charming and bubbly one moment and then go stone serious the next. And I remember once I was in her office at Lincoln Center when she was at Lincoln Center, and we were talking about something in great detail, and she was interesting. And then in mid-sentence, she stood up, walked to the back of that large office, tapped on her computer at a time when computers were bigger, and she was checking Lincoln Center's investment portfolio.
Hmm.
So obviously, whatever it was that we were talking about was boring to her at that point. But she was the type who would just do what she felt she had to do. When she retired from singing and then retired from arts administration, she said famously that she wanted to just put her feet up and smell the roses. But within about a month, she said, "I'm allergic to roses."
Yes, absolutely. She was driven by work, no question of it. But extremely bright, very personable, very extremely knowledgeable.
She had
She
a
knew what
talk
she was
show.
doing. No
She
question.
was a fantastic fundraiser. She was a very close friend of the journalist Barbara Walters.
Hmm.
And they were very, very close. And Barbara Walters, and again, I'm not getting political here, but I'm just speaking politics. Barbara Walters was friendly with a lot of Republicans. I don't know what her politics were. Beverly Sills was the first person in the arts, major person in the arts, to embrace Michael Bloomberg,
Hmm.
who was then an independent, somewhat Republican candidate for mayor who won. And when she kind of gave the okay for Michael Bloomberg, many people joined her in supporting him to replace Rudolph Giuliani in 2001. But I remember a few years later when the New York City Opera, her company, was having financial troubles, I actually spoke to the mayor, who has tons of money and is very generous in a lot of ways to the arts and certainly to medicine, public health. Um, the city opera needed about 20 million. He said it's not a good investment. So he wouldn't give the money that would have saved the company of the person who basically helped make him mayor
Hmm.
through her advocacy for him.
Well, it's like another line of Bloomberg's who once said, "Well, I could have been president of Lincoln Center or a mayor of New York. Being mayor of New York is cheaper."
And easier. And
Yeah.
finally, because you and I know this stuff, especially you, for listeners from abroad who may not know about how foundations work and the role of foundations, in this case, supporting the arts, but foundations support education, medicine, all kinds of things. But in this case, the arts, how does that work?
All foundations are different, just like people are different. Each foundation has its own guidelines, its own priority. In our case, there are two programs, both of them directed to New York City. One is for performing arts, the other is for geriatric healthcare. And in for viewers from abroad, where there's government subsidy, the prime benefactor tends to be the government. And
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, the prime benefactors um, are a mosaic of foundations, individual donors, all of whom give whatever money they can afford to give or can budget for, and that fills in the deficit gap that in Europe and other countries the government pays for. And one reason why, let's say, the Metropolitan Opera House is as big physically as it is, why it has 3,800 seats. And the old house, the original house, when the Metropolitan Opera opened in 1883, it had 3,100 seats.
Mm-hmm.
Then they discovered by eliminating boxes and replacing them with individual seats, they could increase the capacity so that eventually the old Met has a capacity of 3,600 seats. And then the new house at Lincoln Center has 3,775 seats. So it's only a little bit bigger than the old theater. But the reason for that is that they had to sell tickets because the government was in the United States was not providing any funding. And again, if we go back to the Rockefeller those years, the hope was that America would turn the corner in terms of cultural policy, and that through these government agencies like the National Endowment for the Arts, there would be serious subsidy for arts organizations in America, but it never happened. And the main difference between the European system or the foreign system and the United States system is not just that in one case you have the government providing funding, and in our case it's from foundations or private donors, but what allows all those private donors to be motivated to give money to culturals or hospitals or social service groups, whatever, is that they're allowed to then deduct that money from their tax bills.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the motivation. That if you, it would not be true of a foundation, which is in effect a not-for-profit business that is giving money away from its portfolio and its earnings. But for a wealthy individual who makes a contribution to a museum or an opera company or a theater, they can then deduct that amount or a portion of that amount from their tax bills.
So, I asked, and I mentioned Colleen Dewhurst for me, Rosemary Harris for you, in terms of a first crush in the theater. Did you have someone, male, female, doesn't matter, who you heard in opera and thought, wow, I
Oh,
like opera?
absolutely. I could say two
Go ahead.
completely different kinds of singers. Number one, the singer of singers, Leontyne Price.
Yeah,
Number one.
absolutely.
I'm gonna mention three.
Okay.
First, Price, the singer of singers. Two, in terms of dramatic singing, stage presence, John Vickers,
Yep.
whom you could not take your eyes off, and I still think of as the most persuasive performer of any stripe of neurotic characters on stage. No one
Yep.
could convey fear and a kind of neurotic fear more than Vickers. And the third in the recital realm would be Janet Baker, who
Mm-hmm.
was not only a great singer and an extraordinary recitalist, but Baker had that very, very special gift of standing in a large hall like Carnegie, let's say, and somehow miraculously being able to focus her voice so that wherever you sat in that hall, you could be in the last row of the top tier, you felt as though that voice was being sent right to you. It was like in a beam right up to you. And so I would say in three very, very different ways, Leontyne Price, John Vickers, Janet Baker.
And next time I see you, I'll tell you mine.
Very
I
good,
just
friend.
want listeners to know. I mean, I've wanted Rob to join me for a long time. This happened because a few months ago, I was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art outside the Impressionist area, and so was Rob. And I ran into Rob. We sat down on the bench and we're catching up. And I said, here's your invitation. So, Rob Marx, thank you so much for fulfilling the invitation and
Glad
for
to be here.
everything that you do for the arts, which I notice and I respect you for, and I want more people to know what you do. So, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.